Hello, everyone. My name is Roopa, and I'm an associate professor in the Faculty of Education at York in Toronto, Canada. I want to begin by thanking Sharon for this invite and for being the person that she is, the scholar that she is, and the wonderfully warm, lovely colleague that she is. Thanks, Sharon, for initiating this network on critical internationalization and for always challenging us to critically examine our critical approaches to internationalization. So thank you. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the treaty lands that each of us are currently located on. I would like to recognize the harm done to indigenous communities, their languages, their ways of knowing and being. I recognize the privilege received by working on these lands of indigenous peoples. While all of us are located throughout Canada and perhaps other parts of the world, I acknowledge that the land I am on, which is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe. This territory is covered by Upper Canada treaties, and it's within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. My research to date has largely focused on trying to historically map government and in particular federal policy on the internationalization of higher education. I've looked at various global trends across governments, institutional approaches, and student experiences in attempting to understand why different groups or actors engage with internationalization, how they engage, and what they come to understand as internationalization of higher education. And by virtue of my research focus, I've examined I'll put more emphasis in understanding student mobility, particularly inward student mobility. That is how international students have become sort of the defining feature of international education policy. And my focus has largely been on universities. Given all of this, I would likely be found guilty of what Shahjahan and Kesar critique as methodological nationalism. Yes, as a new immigrant to Canada, I've been somewhat obsessed with understanding Canada as defined as a unit of analysis by its national boundaries. And in this sense, as I said before, I could be critiqued in terms of performing methodological nationalism. Yet ironically, as my principal argument is against privileging our nationally bound definitions and interest, perhaps these scholars will excuse me and allow me the privilege of being a hybrid methodological nationalist and a geopolitical scholar. I am a firm believer that the national context does impact the kind of policy discourse across policy actors in various locales. Today in my presentation, I want to achieve three goals. I want to look back and speak historically to how we arrived to our context pre-COVID times. Next, I want to consider how this context has impacted and influenced our COVID responses. And finally, I want to end with some kind of brief discussion on some hopeful solutions or call to actions, if you will, as we would like, or I would like for us to move towards a new paradigm shift in international education. America First, an explicit policy most recently embraced by the administration of US President Donald Trump, refers to a policy that prioritizes the interests of citizens and their sovereign rights as described by a nation state. As Canadians, several of us critique Trump and mock his America First explicit policies as too nationalistic, protectionist, and isolationist. However, I ask, how different have our implicit Canadian policies been in context of how we have come to understand and pursue international education? Today, I will speak to the problematic Canada First policies that we have come to now embrace in our fervent pursuit of international education. How we have become so blinded by our own rhetoric of Canada as an open and multicultural society that we seldom concern ourselves with questioning our Canada First approaches to international education. So let me begin with a few reflections. I very vividly remember reading Robin Farquhar's article in my first few years of professional life in Canada. It was titled, "Can Canada Get Its Act Together in International Education?" And today, Farquhar would be completely surprised and taken aback by what he would see. We don't have one, but two national international education strategies. The federal government has made financial commitments, albeit to a small scale, on various educational marketing and other initiatives. We have an established Edu-Canada unit within Global Affairs Canada, and the Immigration Canada department has coordinated a systematic stream of international student program policies and processes. All of this, which would have been unthinkable during Farquhar days, when there was a lot of lament about Canada not having a vision and an agenda for international education. So given this, could we say that Canada has achieved the impossible? Let's look a little further back in history. I know several of us have heard this to perhaps nauseam, where international education in Canada is linked to development cooperation with the government, development cooperation initiatives, and the bringing of international students from developing countries on various scholarship programs. Of course, there's a rich and excellent critique of this time period as well, by McCartney, by Stein, and others, critiquing how this perspective on international students as worthy recipients of Canadian aid, or international students as charity, is highly problematic, in spite of the fact that we had what might have been considered a more global approach then. Perhaps what's less well known to some extent is that during this time, as well in the 60s, we had an academic relations section in our Foreign Affairs Department, which looked at building relations between Canadian foreign policy and bringing it input from the academic community. We had a Canadian studies program that was alive and well. And perhaps more importantly, there were discussions of trying to integrate foreign relations, regional studies, language studies in Canadian universities funded by the federal government. What's important to note during this time is the federal government thought this was inappropriate to be funding these kinds of initiatives and directly working with universities on these kinds of initiatives, because they felt, A, education was a provincial responsibility, but more importantly, that universities should be respected for their academic freedom and institutional autonomy. Fast forward. More current times, the impossible became possible. In 2014, we had the first ever international education strategy, followed in 2019 by an updated strategy. Is this a seismic shift within the Canadian context? I would think so if you looked at articles like those written by Farquhar. Why? Because historically, as I mentioned, the Canadian federal government always had a pushback from the provincial government in terms of educational matters, even international education matters. The federal government itself didn't want to cross these boundaries and didn't want to directly influence universities, claiming issues of importance in terms of university autonomy and academic freedom. So what then was the result of this kind of dramatic change in terms of how the federal government got involved and how we moved in this direction of a coordinated policy? I'll go on to speak about 4 factors that I think have created this shift in policy, but more importantly, these are the same factors. These are the same 4 factors that I identify as the most problematic policy discourses in Canada that have resulted in what I label the obsessive Canada first approach to international education. The first, international education as a nation-building initiative. Scholars like Vara have spoken to nationalistic moralization, where national interest is seen as the key value in promoting policy discourse. The international education discourse has first and foremost been legitimized as critical to Canada's success, its long-term economic security for a more prosperous, more innovative, and more competitive Canada. Interestingly, if you look at government documents, the terms international dimension and internationalization came into government vocabulary at the exact time in the 80s and the 90s when when there was marked austerity and severe budget cuts. It was a time when Canada develops a singular focus on promoting its international trade to enhance its economy. It's a time when Team Canada missions became popular, with university presidents participating and giving a clear signal that they've recognized higher education as a business sector as well as governments had. This national competitiveness agenda was even heightened further under the Harper government when he linked Canadian immigration policy with international education and the economic imperative. There was more of a bullish focus on recruitment and keeping students, international students, as our future ideal immigrants. So this combination of the trade and immigration agendas were recognized as crucial to Canada's economic prosperity in the context of globalization, and this national imperative became the driving force of international education. Interestingly enough, this push came through no matter what political party we had. Conservatives and liberals both built this narrative of the national building exercise, and each of the governments stayed the course of defining international education as economic and trade imperative. The second component, growing policy alignment across several policy actors. This logic of national competitiveness and advantage was so appealing that something that would not have happened or seldom happens in a decentralized federation like us in Canada happened. The provincial government started working very closely with the federal government, mostly in the sense that a lot of provincial governments, when they were marketing education abroad, soon realized they had to market Canadian education, not Ontario education, not Manitoba education, but they had to compete with the Australians and the UK that had a national brand of education. So they soon realized the importance of needing to work collaboratively with the federal government. Similarly, universities saw the need to align with provincial policy as well as eventually federal policy, because they realized they were making good funding through these initiatives, that they were bringing in a lot of money through international educational initiatives. So in this sense, what happened was, with this policy alignment, three things happened. There was an increased recognition of the federal government having a legitimate role to play in international education, which might not have been there in the past. A very unified voice was developing in Canada in terms of international education, albeit in very narrow terms in terms of economic nation building. And third, increasing cooperation to be globally competitive became the mantra, where cooperation meant a win-win situation for all within the Canadian context, because it put Canada first. The third factor, universities as distinct actors started losing their voice and their role. There was a time in the 2009-10 era when a lot of scholars talked about how there was no pan-Canadian initiative, and universities were having sort of ad hoc initiatives in internationalization, their own way of defining, regional ways of defining internationalization. All this changed quite rapidly. And there was a time when CBIE took the initiative in defining education as trade for the educational sector. Both federal and provincial governments started commenting on how universities were very enthusiastic, university presidents specifically were very enthusiastic participants in Team Canada missions in large numbers. So universities were giving a clear sign that they were complicit and supported the recognition of higher education as a sector within the Canada's trade sector. They saw that, as I mentioned before, that the recruitment was bringing in quick money, a very good, easy revenue stream when there were some universities having challenging with domestic supply of students and declining public funds. Today, international student tuitions in some places make up 30% of revenue, if not higher. And this 30% relates to 25 to 24% coming from provincial funds and domestic tuition. The point being, a high reliance on these funding sources have made universities work collaboratively with governments and provincial, both federal and provincial, and lose their distinctive voice in terms of their role in international education. So by embracing national agendas tied to neoliberal principles of market-based competitions, universities became cooperative actors to government nationalistic agendas. Finally, the fourth factor, allowing a global ethical and moral vacuum in the pursuit of international education for national goals is what we have allowed. Ironically, defining the purpose of international education as serving national economic benefits has enabled us to divorce priorities such as social justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, as well as the more recent efforts in implementing the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for Education, for Indigenous education, from international education policies and practices. Framing international students as outsiders, external to the nation state, in the dominant trope that Stein and Andreotti speak of in terms of cash cows that are brought in for the benefit of the nation state, somehow absorbed us policymakers from educational principles that we generally espouse in universities. For example, there's so little concern expressed regarding the significant inequalities of opportunity for potential international students, nor concerns of who we attract by way of international students when it comes to race, class, gender, identity, religion, physical ability, factors that otherwise we look at, or at least attempt to look at in terms of access in higher education. Christina Ayau criticizes or critiques the dehumanizing that happens when international students come to be viewed as commodities, as imports and exports, to promote self-centered national priorities. She goes on to suggest that such practices in effect enact academic imperialistic practices under the guise of internationalization. And ironically, these are the practices that are in direct violation of ethical codes of practice that universities subscribe to in terms of dealing with issues of EDI and Indigenous reconciliation. So where does this context leave us today in our current COVID-19 period? What kinds of discussions are we asking? What are our concerns? How do we want to move forward? And my central concern is during this time, or any time of crisis, but during this COVID-19 period, will this give us a moment of pause, a possible rupture in our blinded approaches? Will it serve as a wake-up call to our myopic Canada First blinders? Now, we've had past experiences, perhaps, crisis may be strong, but global shifts in many ways in international education. Let's look at how we reacted then and how that reaction might influence how we react today in terms of the COVID-19 period. So looking at geopolitical shifts, we have the Brexit example, we have election of Donald Trump, for example. And interestingly enough, both of these were catalysts for Canada's success in recruiting international students. The government of Canada, in fact, has proudly proclaimed of the advantage that we've taken from the fallout of the international student market in the UK and the dysfunctional US immigration system. The Trump bump, as it's labeled in Canada, has been celebrated. Look at the quote by President of University of Toronto, Gertler. He speaks about how Canada has emerged as a beacon of stability, openness, tolerance, and inclusion, and was seen as an increasingly, or is seen as an increasingly rare bright light on the world stage. So some geopolitics have given us success. Of course, there are others that have interrupted our success. We've had diplomatic spat most recently with Saudi Arabia and China. In terms of Saudi Arabia, the Saudi government, we got concerned because they canceled the scholarship of their sponsored students. And what was our reaction? We were totally concerned with losing these students because it meant estimating $140 million in terms of revenues that suddenly disappeared. So warnings of that kind. In terms of China, we're not sure how things will move, but there is a great concern because Chinese students are a large percentage, if not the largest, of international students in Canada. And we have several research ties, lots of funding from Chinese partners, estimated at multi-million-dollar research investments. So what have our solutions been to these kinds of crises, these kinds of interruptions in the past? Our concern has been immediately to protect our economic benefits and minimize economic fallouts. Our solutions, therefore, have been mitigating business risk. How do we do that? Diversify source countries of international students. That's the solution. And the quote, again, to attract these diverse students is from our most recent policy as well. It's quoted there. This is the way to move forward. Look at new markets, enter new markets, and diversify our trade folio, a simple trade solution. Recognizing the limitations of our Canada First approach and questioning or challenging its relevance, given shifting geopolitical context, has been far from our minds. Any of our policymakers, government, non-governmental organizations, even universities, it's been far from our minds. So what do we know today in this COVID period? It's no different. Our concerns, discussions, solutions seem to be along the same lines. Usher has captured it, Alex Usher has captured it excellently, where he talks about our main concern is what is going to happen with enrollments in the fall, particularly international enrollments. You can look at a spate of articles and discussions across the higher education sector. Most are concerned with enrollments and loss of revenue. Lots of estimations made of what they will look like, when they will look like, where will the numbers drop. And here's what Usher suggests. He suggests there might be a silver lining for Canada, even though numbers will fall overall, because should the pandemic not yet be under control south of the border by November, or should Trump get reelected, we might even get an extra enrollment boost. Key message, keep focused on our national advantage, even at the expense of our neighbors. This is considered fair, even in this problematic context of a global pandemic. Universities Canada, Paul Davis is the president, reinforcing this national logic for international education in spite of and because of the context of COVID-19. He goes on talking about how important it is in these times that we continuously attract and send a good message to international students about their being welcome. Why? He explains their value to us within the Canadian context. They are bigger than the export of auto parts. This is Universities Canada representing Canadian university interests. He goes on to say, international students play an essential role in responding to this crisis and in helping Canada recover and thrive in a post-COVID-19 world. Leveraging international education, the people-to-people ties it generates is a sound investment towards a more globally connected and prosperous Canada. Again, message remains clear. International students are important for Canada's national advantage. And what's more, this advantage is what will enable Canada to thrive and prosper in a post-COVID-19 world. I've been impressed with the quick and dramatic changes made by Immigration Canada, something we've rarely seen in the past. A loud and clear message, Canada is open to international education business. There's a series of new initiatives put in to provide this message. We've also had many self-congratulating assurances, such as, and I'm taking a direct quote from an article title, despite hesitation, these Chinese students, they still plan to study in Canada. And many other references to studies that talk about how international students want to continue to study abroad. And Canada is a promising place to come to. In spite of all of this, there are some warnings, and a scholar like Simon Marginson has put forth several warnings that might concern Canadian universities. He talks about the reduction in the GDP the reduction in the global middle class, that there's going to be a shrinking of globally mobile students. We're going to suffer the consequences of revenues for the next 5 years to come. It's going to be a buyer's market. There's going to be a scarcity of students and much more competition, and much more intense competition. He talks about how global mobility trends are going to shift. They're going to shift from the east to the west, especially towards East Asia, where East Asia is identified as rising economically, and it will rise further in international education because of strong health and government's regimes which have helped them bounce back further. So again, a paranoia. So where does all of this leave Canada? How are we going to face this new and challenging world? Are we going to accept, as Usher suggests, that the international student gravy train is actually over, which is what Marginson is also suggesting, and that some institutions are going to face some solvency issues? Or are we going to up the game because Marginson says and others suggest there's going to be more competition, and therefore compete even harder to get our share of international students? Or are we really going to take some time to do some hard thinking about why we're engaging in international education and how we're engaging in it in the first place? Now, undoubtedly, during this period, we've had a moment of pause. There have been discussions on how internationalization will take on different forms in the years to come. Because obviously, we cannot travel as much. There aren't international meetings. There aren't in-person classes. Study abroad might go virtual. Internationalization at home may take precedence. But really, these discussions are far more limited when you look at the overwhelming focus on international student enrollments, funding, and the ability to attract international students in spite of online education. So to answer my own question, can global crises like COVID-19 serve as possible ruptures to our blinded approaches? Can they serve as wake-up calls to our myopic Canada First blinders? Yes, the answer is yes, they can. But in the case of Canada, in reality, this is not the case as far as I can see. To date, our response has largely been, as Stein has referenced earlier, alluding to another issue, we don't interrupt or challenge our ways, but we continue as business as usual. Even Hans David, who's pretty conservative in how he looks at internationalization, has basically suggested we're going to simply press the reset button. And this is very worrisome and a real reality in terms of the Canadian case. The reason being because the national agenda, the nation first agenda, is so appealing to most of us that even in the context of a global pandemic, we do not question the narrowness of our approach to internationalization. And this narrow approach has been fueled by what I have suggested, this close policy alignment across policy actors, universities having lost their unique voices, and the void of issues of social justice and equity in international education discussions. Is there any hope? Jenny Lee suggests that we're facing unprecedented times that require unprecedented actions to transform ourselves and our institutions in preparation for a new era. I have to be hopeful. So let's discuss some possible ways forward. My hope really comes from various sources. If we've had a seismic shift before, it is possible. But what is needed and what is our hope to begin with? To me, the big strand of hope comes from the first global protest movement of the COVID-19 period, the anti-racism demonstrations that have brought solidarity action across so many different countries, as diverse, not only in the West, but in Nigeria, Kenya, Argentina, Hong Kong, many, many places. Our hope is that these grassroots global solidarity movements will challenge us in how we think of geography, politics of the nation state, and our discourses around national advantage. They will also build our belief in what we share as humans across the globe. The pandemic is a clear manifestation of our shared world, and also how issues, social, cultural, health, are not bound by national boundaries. Power struggles, exploitation, and inequities work both within and across borders and require collaboration and solidarity across nations for their resolution. This is what the current anti-racism protests are illustrating and why they will be effective. Another ray of hopes comes from us, faculty, students, researchers, scientists, who will push governments and universities towards a commitment to what Sabsavila reference as scientific globalism. So a science or a knowledge production that's universal, that's not bound by political borders or belonging to certain groups of people, and that is worked at from within the community and being made available to all. So researchers working across national boundaries during this global pandemic to find solutions for COVID-19 and its differential impact will be our hope in challenging deep nationalistic policies. We currently have a government, I think, that speaks a talk but doesn't walk its walk when it comes to multilateralism or international cooperation. What have we done in the higher education sector to remind the government of how these global commitments are linked to the purposes and goals of international education? We in higher education, along with governments, have to shift our self-serving gaze and commit to the larger global good. Albeit I'm not naive, Western societies are in constant danger of overstepping their global colonialist and imperialistic gaze. So we need to return to our earlier focus on the global, be concerned with Canada and the world through international education, but in a context of a decolonizing approach, following the principles that we ourselves have worked and laid out in the TRC. El-Masri speaks eloquently to how international education is not a policy problem per se, but rather is constructed as a policy solution to problems. So far, in terms of immigration, economy, foreign affairs, and trade. So how can we get governments to reframe international education as a policy solution to global problems and global concerns? Universities, we have to recarve our niche and our role as autonomous from governments and contribute to what higher education does best. Promote free flow of ideas, collaboration, and partnership within and across people and borders. Finally, the call to action that I would put forth, if we are to have hope, is to all of us international education and scholars and practitioners. We need to speak about international education and outreach our broader communities. The general public must understand and appreciate international education and its benefit in context of how intricately national benefits and global benefits are tied together. And what better way to do it, or what better time to do this, to make that linkage than during this COVID-19 period. Ironically, international education scholars or our research has rarely been found to influence policymakers. Media rarely approaches researchers. Ultimately, there's a need for public intellectuals who can mediate between education, society, politics, and media. We need to begin building common ground between different policy actors to facilitate a recreation or a reframing of international education. In conclusion, if internationalization is seen as a means to decrease global disparity, prevent exploitation, brain drain, and cultural imperialism, and work to resolve social and global problems, as TIER suggests, we need to do a lot, because in international education in Canada, ironically, we've contributed to the opposite discursive framework. If there is to be hope, we have to reimagine policies and practices of internationalization beyond national interest. But this will require us to first and foremost dismantle the edifice we have built of international education as Canada first. Thank you so much for being patient and listening to me, and I do look forward to our discussions this weekend. Thank you.